Hi everyone, welcome to the channel and enjoy my new story. The Forgotten Voices. I still remember the first time it happened. Emily, my daughter, was 3 years old and sitting cross-legged on the living room rug, her chubby fingers gripping a crayon as she doodled a lopsided house on a sheet of paper. "That's the factory," she said, tilting her head to admire her work. "What factory, sweetheart?" I asked, only half listening. "The one in Dresden. It burned down when the bombs fell. We had to run to the cellar, but the cellar wasn't safe." I froze, my hand tightening around the book I'd been reading. "Dresden?" Emily nodded solemnly, her gaze far away, as though she were somewhere else entirely. "They shouted at us to get out, but it was too late. The roof came down." I stared at her, my stomach churning. Where had she heard that name? Where had she heard anything like this? A few days later, we were in the garden planting tulips. Emily dug into the soil with a small spade, her blonde curls sticking to her sweaty forehead. Out of nowhere, she said, "We had tulips back then, too." "Back when?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Before the war," she said, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "They grew outside our apartment. I could see them from the balcony before the soldiers came." My hands paused in the dirt. "What soldiers, Emily?" "The ones with the gray coats. They marched down the street, shouting. Mama told me not to watch, but I did. They scared me." She looked up at me, her big blue eyes brimming with innocence. "Do you think the tulips will come back, Mommy? They didn't grow after the fire?" I couldn't speak. My throat tightened and I could only nod. The third time, it was even stranger. We were walking through the park on a sunny afternoon, Emily skipping beside me and holding her favorite teddy bear. She suddenly stopped and looked up at the sky, squinting. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" I asked. "It's too quiet," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" She turned to me, her face pale. "It was quiet like this before the planes came. You don't hear them until it's too late. Then the whole street goes dark." I stared at her, my heart pounding. Emily's gaze flicked back to the sky. "Are they coming back, Mommy?" "No," I said quickly, kneeling down to take her hands in mine. "There's nothing to be afraid of." But as I held her, I realized I was the one who was afraid. The next few weeks passed in a haze of unease. Emily's strange statements became more frequent. She spoke of places I'd never mentioned, names I'd never heard. Once, as we passed an old black-and-white photograph in a museum, she pointed at a soldier in the background and said, "That's Heinrich. He was nice to me. He gave me chocolate before he was sent away." It wasn't just what she said. It was how she said it. Calmly, matter-of-factly, as though she weren't a 3-year-old making things up, but someone recalling distant memories. I started writing everything down, dates, names, places. I spent my nights on the computer, searching for connections, for any sign that what she was saying could be explained. And to my horror, I found them. Dresden. Heinrich. The descriptions of streets and factories that no longer existed, yet matched old photographs perfectly. "Kids have imaginations," my husband Peter said one night as I shared my fears. He was sprawled on the couch, his attention divided between me and the hockey game on TV. "She's 3, Peter. She shouldn't know these things." "She probably overheard something on TV." "She doesn't watch TV." "Then you're reading too much into it." I wanted to scream at him, but what was the point? He wasn't listening. The breaking point came one afternoon at Peter's mother's house. Emily was playing in the garden, her laughter carrying through the open window, when I decided to confide in my mother-in-law. I didn't expect her reaction. Her face went pale, and her hands trembled as she set her teacup down. "She told you about Dresden?" she asked in a whisper. "Yes. Why?" For a long moment she said nothing. Then she exhaled shakily and said, "It's happening again." "What's happening again?" Her eyes met mine, and I saw something in them I hadn't noticed before. Fear. "Peter had an older sister," she said slowly. "Caroline. She died before he was born." I blinked. "What does that have to do with Emily?" "When Caroline was Emily's age, she used to say strange things too. She talked about another family, another time. She described places I'd never heard of, names that meant nothing to us. It terrified me." "What happened to her?" "She stopped," my mother-in-law said. "When she turned 5, the memories faded. But for 2 years," she shook her head, "for 2 years I lived in fear. I still don't know what it meant." The conversation haunted me. Emily's strange knowledge didn't fade. It only grew sharper. She stopped calling me Mommy and started using another name. Annalise. She avoided loud noises, covering her ears and crying whenever a plane flew overhead. One morning, as I combed her hair for preschool, Emily looked at me in the mirror and said, "You're different now." "Different how, sweetheart?" I asked, my hand faltering. "You don't braid my hair the same way," she said. "Annalise always used ribbons." I froze. "Emily, who's Annalise?" She turned to me, frowning. "You are. Don't you remember?" I stared at her reflection, the hairbrush slipping from my fingers. Another time, we were walking through the grocery store when Emily stopped dead in her tracks, staring at an elderly man near the produce aisle. "What's wrong?" I whispered, bending down to her level. She pointed a trembling finger at the man. "He was at the checkpoint. He yelled at me because I dropped the bread." My blood ran cold. The man, oblivious, shuffled past us with a bag of apples in his hand. "What checkpoint, Emily?" She didn't answer. Her little hand gripped mine tightly, and she whispered, "I don't want to see him again." One rainy afternoon, I found her in her room, carefully folding pieces of paper into small, precise squares. She had never shown much interest in crafts before, so I asked, "What are you making, honey?" "Ration books," she replied, her voice distant. "Ration books," I repeated, confused. "For food," she explained patiently, as though it were obvious. "We had to keep them safe, or we wouldn't get any bread, but sometimes the lines were too long and we went hungry anyway." I didn't know what to say. Then came the day at the library. She had been flipping through a book of old maps while I browsed nearby. Suddenly she called out to me, her voice sharp with urgency. "Here," she said, pointing to a small street in Berlin. I leaned over the table. "What about it?" "That's where I lived," she said confidently, "before the war." I stared at the map, my heart pounding. The street name wasn't familiar to me, but the certainty in her voice was impossible to ignore. "Emily, how do you know that?" She looked up at me, her expression almost annoyed. "I just do." Her knowledge didn't just haunt me, it consumed me. One evening, as I tucked her into bed, she grabbed my wrist and whispered, "Don't let them take me again, okay?" "Take you where?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "To the camps," she murmured, her eyes welling up with tears. "They said we'd be safe, but it wasn't true. You promised me." I didn't sleep that night. What could I do about it? Nothing. The years passed, and just as my mother-in-law predicted, the memories began to fade. By the time Emily started school, she was like any other child, chatty, playful, and blissfully unaware of the past. But I couldn't forget. Years later, when Emily was a teenager, she came home from a history lesson, her face pale. "Mom," she said, "we learned about the war today. It was so strange. Why?" "I knew the answers before the teacher said them," she whispered. "It was like I'd been there." I didn't know what to say, and so the questions remained. I never found an answer, never uncovered a reason for the memories that had consumed those early years. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder, if Caroline remembered and Emily remembered, will it happen again? Will it ever stop? Or are we all just echoes of lives we've lived before?